Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Manuel Fernandez, and today I'll be presenting my capstone on the impact of early childhood trauma on emotional regulation and behavioral outcomes in adolescence. This presentation integrates epidemiological research, neurobiological evidence, and clinical intervention models to explain how early adversities shape developmental trajectories and how those trajectories can be modified. The central thesis of this project is that emotional regulation is the key developmental mechanism linking early childhood trauma to adolescent outcome. Early adversity disrupts both relational system and biological stress system. When those systems are altered during sensitive developmental period, children may develop vulnerabilities in emotional control. Adolescence then amplifies those vulnerabilities because it's a period of heightened emotion intensities combined with still developing regulatory systems. So, emotional regulation becomes the bridge between early trauma and later emotional or behavioral problems. In other words, emotional regulation functions as what we call transdiagnostic pathways. That means it does not just predict one specific disorder, instead, it connects early trauma to both internalizing problems like anxiety and depression and externalizing problems like aggression or impulsivity. Rather than viewing trauma as leading to one outcome, we understand it as disrupting regulatory capacities, which then influences multiple developmental domains. The Adverse Childhood Experience Framework, originally developed by Felitti and colleagues, demonstrated a clear dose response relationship. The more ACEs an individual experience, the higher the risk for negative health and behavioral outcomes later in life. ACEs includes abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. What is important here is the cumulative exposure. Risk increase in a graded, predictable pattern. Longitudinal research has consistently replicated this association. Meta-analytic evidence confirms this graded relationship. Higher ACE scores predict higher risk for emotional dysregulation, behavioral difficulties, and later psychopathologies. This is not random, it follows a consistent pattern across developmental stages. The more adversity, the greater the regulatory burden placed on the child. Shankoff and colleagues describe toxic stress as prolonged activation of the stress response system without supportive, buffering relationships. When cortisol systems are activated repeatedly and chronically, biological embedding occurs. This creates what is known as allostatic load, meaning long term psychological strain. Over time, this affects emotional control, impulse regulation, and stress reactivity. From a neurobiological perspective, trauma impacts key brain structures. For example, the amygdalas become more reactive, increasing threat detection. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the regulation and executive control, may show reduced efficiency. Altered connectivity between these regions predicts higher internalizing symptoms, emotional instability. Teacher and Sampson document structural and functional brain differences in individuals exposed to maltreatment. Emotional regulation is not just correlated with trauma, it mediates the relationship. When children struggle to identify, tolerate, or modulate an emotional state, they become more vulnerable to anxiety, depression, aggression, or risk taking behavior. Research by Heleniak and colleagues demonstrated that emotional regulation statistically explains part of the pathway between early maltreatment and adolescent psychopathologies. This makes it clinically actionable. Adolescence is a developmental amplifier. There is an increased emotional intensity, greater peer influence, and ongoing maturation of cognitive control systems. According to Steinberg, the social emotional system develops earlier than the regulatory control system. So adolescents feel more intensively before they can fully regulate those emotions. If trauma has already weakened the regulatory system, adolescence magnifies that vulnerability. The important part is that the pathway is modifiable. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy has strong evidence for reducing trauma symptoms. Parent-child interaction therapy improves attachment security and behavioral regulation. Dialectical behavioral therapy teaches adolescents concrete emotion regulation skills. Clinical trials consistently show meaningful reduction in trauma-related symptoms and self-harming behaviors. This means that intervention can shift developmental trajectories. Beyond treatment, prevention is critical. The CDC and the WHO emphasize safe, stable, nurturing relationships as protective factors. Public health framework aims to reduce exposure to adversity before it accumulates. Trauma-informed systems focus on understanding behaviors through a lens of stress adaptation rather than punishment. Prevention shifts the focus upstream rather than waiting for a pathology to emerge. There are limitations. Measurement heterogeneity makes comparison across studies complex. Much of the research is observational, which limits causal inference. Future research should integrate neurobiological and psychosocial models using longitudinal multi-method approaches. This will strengthen our understanding of mechanism rather than just association. In conclusion, early childhood trauma does not create a deterministic outcome, but it does shape emotional system in a powerful ways. Emotional regulation emerges as a central mechanism linking adversity to adolescent outcomes. Because this pathway is modifiable, intervention and prevention efforts have the power to alter life course trajectories. Understanding mechanism allow us to move from reaction to prevention. Thank you very much. These are the references used in this presentation in an APA 7 format. Thank you again.